All right, guys. I wanted to go through and some of the questions when I asked some of the topics people were interested in. So that's kind of why we have done voting rights last week. We're gonna do foreign policy this week. Somebody else mentioned something about foreign policy. So we're gonna go through foreign policy today. This also kind of ties in with last week, where we're talking about the government expanding voting rights and stuff like that. This is more governmental power as well. All right, so foreign policy. All right, so our instruments of foreign policy. So, how does the federal government work through foreign policy? Number one, military. We use the military to expand our thoughts and our theories on how government should operate, how people should live. It is the oldest and still most commonly used. We have limited quote unquote wars, but we are in 60 or so countries throughout the world. Economic policy is becoming far more powerful, and that includes trade regulations, tariffs, and monetary policies. Also, diplomatic is the quietest of the tools. This is negotiations, summits. Most of the time, people don't know that diplomatic foreign policy is happening until after the fact. So, our actors on the world stage. So we start out here with international organizations. The most common is the United Nations, the UN. It was created in 1945, the successor to the failed League of Nations from World War One. This is an organization whose members agreed to renounce war and respect certain human and economic freedoms. You can say that the United Nations has been successful in preventing wars. Its main goal is to prevent future world wars, and it has done that. Regional organizations. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was created in 1943. It combined the military forces of the U.S., Canada, and most of Western Europe and Turkey. This was originally created as a counter to communism. Soviet Union created something called the Warsaw Pact, where all the communist countries were in one alliance, and all the democracies were in the secondary alliance, which was NATO. Currently, NATO still exists. It is still a powerful entity today. The EU, the European Union, is a transnational government composed of Western European countries that coordinates economic policies. Essentially, the EU has created a nation state out of all of Europe, and the individual countries are sort of like the individual states in the United States. Multinational corporations or non-government organizations, which you guys are going to investigate several of these in the activity that's tied to this. These are groups like Greenpeace or Amnesty International. There are also individuals got people like Bill Gates that do a lot of international foreign relations and things like that. All right, so policymakers, the people who make our foreign policy in the United States. The first one is the president. The president is the head of foreign policy. It's part of one of the roles of the president, one of the hats of the president. The diplomats, the people that the president appoints. Secretary of State, the national security establishment as well. The national security establishment is the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's a Joint Chief for every branch of the military. The National Security Council, the CIA. CIA was formed after World War II to advise the president and gather intelligence. CIA, again, is not allowed to operate on U.S. soil. The CIA is only a foreign organization. Also, Congress, again, because Congress, the Senate, if you remember correctly, the Senate has to approve all treaties signed by the president. All right, so foreign policy. Let's go through the United States history of foreign policy. All right, so we start out with George Washington. We're going all the way back to the beginning of the country. George Washington, in his farewell address, created a sense of isolationism in the United States. All right, so that means the foreign policy where the U.S. tries to stay out of other nations' conflicts, particularly in Europe. George Washington said that the best way for the United States to continue was to ignore Europe and just focus on our own continent. And that really came through really until World War One. We were an isolationist country until World War One. We were only really worried about ourselves and the people in North and South America. James Monroe established this officially. The Monroe Doctrine was the official statement of isolationism. That basically what he said was, Europe, do not interfere in any issues in North and South America. We're going to take care of that. We're not going to go over there and meddle in your stuff. Do not meddle over here. If you got a problem over here, come to us. We'll take care of it. World War One ended the policy of isolationism. If you remember the Zimmerman Note, where from U.S. history, the Germans tried to get Mexico to declare war on the United States, to drag the United States into World War One, and the sinking Lusitania by German U-boats. Those two events pulled the United States into World War One, which was their first time, the United States officially first time sending troops to fight in Europe. Then we're going to get through to. We're going to skip World War Two. In at least in these notes, because World War Two is very studied heavily. Obviously, we were trying to make the world safe, quote unquote, safe for democracy, and root out Hitler and stop the Japanese from conquering all of Asia. All those fancy idealist goals. So we're going to skip right ahead to the Cold War. The Cold War, okay? The Cold War was not an actual war. It was they call it a cooling of relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Essentially, it was democracy against communism, where we fought for containment abroad, but we wanted to keep communism where it was. We did not want communism spreading to other countries. We did not want communism spreading to Cuba and to Vietnam and Korea, which we'll get to in a second. All right, we wanted to promote anti-communism at home. So the containment doctrine is the foreign policy strategy that called for the United States to isolate the Soviet Union, contain its advantages, and resist its encroachments by peace or by force. And the anti-communism at home is best described as the policy of McCarthyism. All right, McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin who played on the fear in the 1950s that international communism was conspiratorial, insidious, and bent on world domination. And he promoted this theory that communists were coming into the United States and were infiltrating American government and cultural institutions. All right, Joseph McCarthy was the guy that promoted this idea. He held public trials in Congress saying that Hollywood actors and directors were communists, that teachers were communists. This is the era where we start to see the Pledge of Allegiance come into every classroom, where "In God We Trust" is put on money. "In God We Trust" is put on money because in a democracy we have freedom of religion, so God favors democracies. In communism, there is no religion in communist countries, so that God shines his redeeming light on, his lowercase g God now, shines his redeeming light on democracies and hates communists. And because we are God-fearing people in a democracy, we are somehow superior to communist people. He also came that what was his downfall was he said that there were communists in the army, and accused the head of the army of being communist. And he would constantly wave around this packet of paper saying, "I have all this evidence here, I have all this evidence here. Look at all this evidence I have." And he never told anybody what the evidence was, never showed anybody what the evidence was, and didn't really have any evidence. He was just going around and saying stuff and accusing people of communists and letting the mob kind of take care of the work for him. All right, this foreign policy of the Cold War, where we're containing communists abroad, leads to the swelling of the Pentagon. It leads to an arms race, which was the nuclear competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. All right, it led to an increased purchasing of military weapons, specifically nuclear weapons. Each country wanted to have the biggest tanks, the fastest and the most stealthy planes, the largest, most destructive nuclear weapons. And again, that all costs money, which means the Pentagon is getting a larger and larger budget every single year. All right, this leads to wars like the Vietnam War, the Korean War. We invaded countries like Bangladesh, India, Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos. All right, we invade these countries, and it leads to something called the domino theory, where if we don't stop communism from spreading to all of Vietnam or all of Korea, then communists can then invade the next country, the next country, the next country, leads to a domino effect, which means that more and more countries become communist, and this is what we were trying to stop. All right, the next era is the era of détente. All right, a détente is a slow transformation from conflict to cooperation, designed to relax tensions between the superpowers. All right, this originally applied to the Soviet Union and then to China. Richard Nixon is one of the famous is the president of this era in the 70s. Okay, where he's the one that kind of tries to start uh, uh, easing the tensions between the two countries to step us back from the brink of nuclear war, like during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He comes in the 70s and tries to kind of ease the tensions. He actually opens up China. He's the first U.S. president to visit China, and kind of starts opening up trade to China and things like that, which then will lead to strategic arms limitation talks. All right, and these are efforts to limit the growth of nuclear arms. All right, where we're starting to sign treaties that will limit the amount of nuclear weapons we could have, the types of nuclear weapons we can have, both in the Soviet Union and in the United States. And from there, we get to the 80s with Ronald Reagan and the Reagan rearmament. All right, the defense budget had been declining since the 50s, with the exception of during the Vietnam War. Reagan adds $32 billion to the defense budget in his first term in office to oppose the quote-unquote Soviet buildup of weapons. All right, Reagan took billions of dollars from education and public education and moved it into the military. All right, he had several of these defense programs that he created, one of them being the Star Wars program, yes, named after the movie series, where he tried to create a system of satellites around the United States that would detect and destroy nuclear weapons that were launched at the United States. This is a real thing. If you want to look it up, you certainly can. All right. And he created the Strategic Defense Initiative, using computers and other equipment to defend against Soviet missiles from space, the Star Wars program. All right. So late 1980s, we're talking this is like the late 1987, 88 is the final thaw in the Cold War. George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush, proposed to move beyond containment to integrate the Soviet Union into the community of nations. This is during Reagan's last year or two in office, is when the Berlin Wall, when he tells Soviet Union to tear down the wall to symbolize the Berlin Wall. And it really was nothing to do with the United States. One of the biggest things that destroyed communism was Coca-Cola and McDonald's, was capitalism. All right. Well, really, the number one person that is responsible for ending the Cold War is Rocky. If you ever watched Rocky 4, when Rocky beats Drago, that was really the end of communism. But George H.W. Bush wanted to integrate the Soviet Union and future Russia into this community of nations, to make them more likely to join capitalist democratic societies. The leadership of the Soviet Union supported the ending of communism and split into about a dozen separate nations. All right, and then during this time, East and West Germany united after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which then led to the healing of most of Europe after World War II. And then we're going to get into the war on terrorism. Okay, this is after 9/11. The war on terrorism became the highest priority of George W. Bush administration. All right, it was not simply just invading Afghanistan. All right, after 9/11, a couple weeks after 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan was wildly popular in the United States. We wanted to get the people who were responsible for attacking New York and Washington. So the invasion of Afghanistan was something that was wildly popular and had 90-some% approval rating. After 9/11 and right around this time, George Bush has the highest approval rating of any president in history. All right. Bush supported preemptive strikes against terrorists and hostile states. He called what he called his axis of evil. His axis of evil was North Korea, Kim Jong-il, the father of the recently deceased Kim Jong-un, the Iran and Iraq headed by Saddam Hussein. He tried to tie Saddam Hussein into funding terrorists and having weapons of mass destruction, and that would then lead to our future invasion of Iraq under the umbrella of the quote-unquote war on terror. All right, international relations entered into an era of improvisation where we didn't really have a strategy. There was no containment or domino theory. It was a lot of firing off the hip of, oh, they might be terrorists or they're harboring terrorists. Let's go get them. And it has led to the situation we are in now, where we have military spread all over the Middle East. We have a lot of countries around the world that do not like us, that think that we are meddling in other countries and other governments when we shouldn't be. And again, this is a 10-year war on terror. All right. In Iraq, Afghanistan and Iraq, the Iraq attack on Afghanistan was the Taliban regime, was the government that was running Afghanistan at the time. They harbored Osama bin Laden and the Al Qaeda network. They allowed them to operate and set up shop in Afghanistan in exchange for large amounts of financial support. The war in Iraq, we essentially, quote unquote, conquered Iraq within like 5 or 6 days. We rolled through Iraq, and that was the easy part. The post-war planning was awful. We did an awful job of how are we going to set up a government? How are we going to set up a democracy? How are we going to give this country back to the people? There really was no plan for that. It was soon we're going to roll through the military, and then it was an oh crap, now what moment. Public support has declined for the war in Iraq. The war on terror and the war in Iraq are the longest wars in U.S. history. They also have the highest casualty counts of any war in United States history. That's more than the Civil War, more than World War I, World War II, Vietnam, all of the above. Terrorism beyond Afghanistan and Iraq will be difficult to combat because terrorism is not like we attack one single country. You're attacking small groups of cells, and it's very hard to stamp out something like that. So our defense policy, defense spending currently takes up about 1/5 of the entire federal budget. Conservatives, Republicans, argue against budget cuts that would leave the military, quote unquote, unprepared. Liberals or Democrats argue for budget cuts to provide more money for programs here in the United States. So a Democrat would argue that we should cut defense spending in order to spend more on things like Social Security, universal health care, basic income, things like that. All right, military spending is hard to cut since it means a loss of jobs in congressional districts. Like, for example, the new F-35 plane that they're building, parts of that are built in all 50 states. The trend in reductions, again, reversed after 9/11, where we have spent more and more money every single year on defense. The defense policy keeps going up. Personnel, 1.3 million active and reserve United States troops. We have more reliance on the National Guard and reserve troops due to some cuts in defense spending, where you're rotating active duty back to the United States. So now the reserve troops and National Guard have to step up. In terms of weapons, we have a large reliance still on the nuclear triad of ICBMs or intercontinental ballistic missiles, SLBMs, and strategic bombers. This stuff is expensive, like $5.5 trillion per year. We have treaties such as START, designed to reduce nuclear missiles, but we still have tens of thousands of nuclear missiles spread around the United States. We also have high-tech non-nuclear weapons that are becoming more and more prevalent, drone strikes and things like that. We have the third largest standing army in the world, behind China and India. All right, our global agenda. Military might is no longer the primary instrument of foreign policy. It's losing its utility to solve many international issues, again, because you can't just invade a country to try to get out a small group of terrorists. That's not going to fly. Economic sanctions are becoming more and more the way to go in foreign policy. These are non-military penalties imposed on foreign countries in an attempt to modify their behavior. Generally, they're the first resort in a crisis. They can be effective, right? Where you're saying we're not going to provide aid or food or whatever to a country until you meet these certain conditions. But critics do argue that they hurt U.S. businesses who are trying to sell their goods to these specific countries and can provoke a nationalist backlash. It also hurts the citizens of that country. There might be food shortages and famines and things in those countries as a result of economic sanctions. Nuclear proliferation is the final thing we're going to look at today. Nuclear proliferation is only a few countries have known nuclear weapons capabilities. There are only a handful of countries that have known to have a nuclear warhead capability. All right, the fear is that rogue countries or smaller countries will have nuclear weapon capabilities and then use them against their neighbors and the United States. The nuclear technology is spreading around the world to countries that maybe we don't want to have them. And the U.S. will focus on discouraging the deployment of developed nuclear weapons. All right, that is it for this lesson. I will post the two activities, the non-government organizations graphic organizer and the lecture response on the Google Classroom at the end of the day. They will be posted on the end of the day. Today is Monday. If you have any questions, please email me. I'm on my computer all the time. Please stay safe. If you have any issues, comments, questions, concerns, as always, please email me and I will respond back to you as quick as I can.